When passengers mock a flight attendant, they have no idea who she really is. What happens next will leave you speechless. Will she reveal her true identity? Or will she teach them a lesson they'll never forget? The hum of the airplane engines provided a steady backdrop to the chaos unfolding in the first-class cabin. Sabrina adjusted her uniform, smoothing the crisp navy blue blazer adorned with the airline's golden crest. Her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, but no one bothered to read it. To the passengers, she was just another flight attendant. Someone to fetch drinks, fluff pillows, and endure their complaints with a smile. The flight was packed, and the passengers were restless. A delay on the tarmac had set the tone for the journey, and the entitled elite in first class were not shy about voicing their displeasure. Sabrina moved gracefully through the aisle, her expression calm but her eyes sharp, taking in every detail. She had spent years perfecting this mask of composure, a skill honed through countless boardroom meetings and high-stakes negotiations. But tonight, she wasn't in a boardroom. Tonight, she was undercover, working as a flight attendant to assess the customer service experience firsthand. It was a decision born of necessity, a way to see the cracks in the system that no report could reveal. "Excuse me," a man in his 50s barked, snapping his fingers at her. He wore a tailored suit and a Rolex that probably cost more than Sabrina's monthly salary. "How long does it take to get a gin and tonic?" "I've been waiting for 15 minutes. Sabrina forced a polite smile, though her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I apologize for the delay, sir. I'll bring your drink right away." As she turned to leave, she overheard him mutter to his companion, "Useless. They hire anyone these days, don't they?" The word stung, but Sabrina didn't flinch. She had heard worse, much worse. At the back of the cabin, a group of young women in designer clothes giggled loudly, their voices carrying over the low hum of the engines. One of them, a blonde with a perfectly manicured hand, waved Sabrina over. "Can we get some champagne? And make sure it's chilled this time," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Of course," Sabrina replied, her voice steady. She noted the subtle sneer on the woman's face but said nothing. As she prepared the drinks, Sabrina's mind wandered. She thought about the boardroom meetings, the strategic decisions, the countless hours she had spent building the airline from the ground up. None of these passengers would ever guess that the woman refilling their glasses was the CEO of the entire company. But Sabrina hadn't expected the level of entitlement and disrespect she was witnessing. She had faced countless challenges in her career, but this was different. This was personal. As she delivered the champagne to the group of women, one of them smirked and said, "Thanks, sweetie. Try to keep up next time. Okay?" Sabrina's jaw tightened, but she simply nodded and walked away. She couldn't afford to blow her cover yet. Back in the galley, Sabrina took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the counter. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm under pressure, but tonight was testing her limits. Just then, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Hey, are you okay?" Sabrina turned to see a man in his early 30s standing in the galley doorway. He had kind eyes and a disarming smile. His name tag read Alex, and he was one of the other flight attendants. "I'm fine," Sabrina said quickly, straightening her posture. "Just a long day." Alex studied her for a moment, as if he could see through her facade. "They can be brutal up there," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "Don't let them get to you." Sabrina forced a smile. "I won't." But as she returned to the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be unlike any other. The passengers' arrogance was a spark, and Sabrina's patience was the kindling. It was only a matter of time before the fire ignited. Sabrina held the tray firmly, her fingers gripping the edges until her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the laughter and disdainful glances following her down the aisle. As she walked back to the galley, the man in the tailored suit's comment echoed in her mind. "They hire anyone these days, don't they?" She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and imagining the day he would discover who she really was. A faint smile formed on her lips but was quickly replaced by an expression of determination. This was going to be a long night, and she couldn't afford to falter. When she entered the galley, Alex was there organizing some bottles. He looked at her, noticing the tension in her face. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Sabrina hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Everything's fine. Just difficult passengers, as usual." Alex studied her face for a moment, as if he knew there was more behind her words. But he didn't press. Instead, he offered an encouraging smile. "If you need help, just say the word." Sabrina thanked him with a nod, but her gaze was already distant, fixed on the aisle where the passengers continued to laugh and mock. She knew the night still held many surprises. The airplane soared through the night, its cabin dimly lit by the soft glow of overhead lights. Sabrina moved through the aisle with practiced ease, her hands steady as she collected empty glasses and straightened seat belts. The passengers had settled into a restless quiet, their earlier complaints replaced by the occasional murmur or the rustle of a magazine. But Sabrina's mind was far from calm. The weight of her dual identity, CEO and flight attendant, pressed heavily on her, and the passenger's entitlement gnawed at her patience. She had come on this flight to observe, but now she felt the urge to act. As she worked, fragments of her past flickered through her thoughts like scenes from an old film. She remembered the cramped apartment she had shared with her mother, the late nights spent studying by the light of a flickering lamp, and the day she had walked into the airline's headquarters for her first job, a low-level administrative position. Back then, she had been invisible, just another face in the crowd. But Sabrina had always been a fighter. She had climbed the corporate ladder one rung at a time, earning respect through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in her vision. She had transformed the struggling airline into a global powerhouse, all while staying true to her values. But somewhere along the way, she had lost touch with the people who made it all possible. The employees who dealt with passengers like these every day. Sabrina's gaze drifted to the man in the tailored suit, now snoring softly in his seat. He had no idea who she was, no idea that the woman he had dismissed so casually held the power to upend his world. A small, bitter smile tugged at her lips. She had spent years building this company, and now she was seeing its flaws firsthand. The entitlement, the disrespect. It was systemic and it had to change. "Need a hand?" Sabrina turned to see Alex standing beside her, his arms laden with blankets. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Thanks," she said, taking a few blankets from him. "They're a tough crowd tonight." Alex chuckled. "First class always is, but you're handling it like a pro." Sabrina glanced at him, curious. There was something about Alex, an air of quiet confidence that set him apart from the others. He didn't seem jaded or weary, just observant. "How long have you been with the airline?" she asked as they distributed the blankets. "About 5 years," Alex replied. "I started in economy, worked my way up. It's not glamorous, but it has its moments." Sabrina nodded, her respect for him growing. She knew how grueling the job could be, how thankless. Yet here he was, still smiling, still kind. It was a stark contrast to the passengers' behavior, and it made her wonder how many other employees felt the same way. Unseen, undervalued, but still dedicated. As they worked, Sabrina noticed how the passengers treated Alex. They were polite, almost deferential, a stark contrast to the way they spoke to her. It wasn't just her gender, she realized, it was her role. To them, she was a servant, not a person. The realization ignited a spark of anger, but Sabrina quickly tamped it down. She couldn't afford to lose control, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth about her company's customer service. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed further, Sabrina retreated to the galley for a moment of solitude. She pulled out her phone and opened a private folder filled with notes and observations from her undercover flights. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the systemic issues plaguing her airline. But tonight's flight was different. Tonight, the stakes felt personal. As Sabrina scrolled through her notes, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're not like the others, are you?" She looked up to see Alex leaning against the galley doorway, his arms crossed and a knowing smile on his face. "What do you mean?" Sabrina asked, her tone cautious. "You're too composed." Alex said. Most of us would have snapped by now. But you're playing the long game. Sabrina's heart skipped a beat. Was he onto her? She studied his face, searching for any hint of suspicion, but found only curiosity. Yeah, I just have a high tolerance for nonsense, she said lightly. Alex laughed. Fair enough. But if you ever need an ally, I'm here. His words lingered in the air as he walked away, leaving Sabrina to ponder their meaning. Could she trust him? Or was he just another player in this high-stakes game? Sabrina looked at Alex, their eyes meeting in a silence heavy with meaning. He knew there was more to her, something she wasn't ready to reveal. But for now, he seemed willing to wait. She turned away, gazing down the dimly lit aisle of the plane, where passengers now slept or dozed, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Sabrina tightened her grip on the small notebook in her hands, feeling the power of the notes she had taken. Each name, each observation was a piece of the puzzle she was assembling. It's not over yet, she murmured to herself as the plane continued to cut through the night sky. Suddenly, the man in the tailored suit appeared at the entrance to the galley, his face red with anger. You, he shouted, pointing at Sabrina. You did that on purpose, didn't you? That seat, the temperature. You're messing with me. Sabrina remained calm, raising an eyebrow. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just doing my job. If there's a problem, I can call the captain. The man hesitated, clearly surprised by her firmness. He opened his mouth to respond, but instead muttered something inaudible and walked away. Alex looked at Sabrina, a faint smile forming on his lips. You're good at this, he said. Sabrina didn't respond, but her gaze was distant, already planning her next move. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting the cabin and sending a ripple of gasps through the passengers. Overhead bins rattled, and a few drinks spilled onto trays, but Sabrina remained steady, her hand gripping the galley counter as the aircraft shuddered. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and reassuring, but the passengers' nerves were frayed. The man in the tailored suit clutched his armrest, his face pale, while the group of women in designer clothes exchanged nervous glances, their earlier arrogance momentarily forgotten. Sabrina seized the moment. She stepped into the aisle, her posture commanding, and addressed the cabin with a voice that cut through the tension. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing some minor turbulence, but everything is under control. Your safety is our top priority. Her words were firm yet soothing, and the passengers instinctively obeyed, their earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of unease. Sabrina's calm authority was a stark contrast to their panic. They began to see her as more than just a flight attendant. She moved through the cabin, checking on each passenger with a quiet efficiency that left no room for complaints. The man in the tailored suit avoided her gaze, his earlier bravado gone. The group of women sat in silence, their champagne glasses forgotten. Alex watched from the galley, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had seen enough to know that Sabrina was no ordinary flight attendant, but he still couldn't quite figure her out. There was something deliberate about her that set her apart from the others. He had been watching her all night, his curiosity growing with each passing hour. She wasn't just handling difficult passengers. She was playing a game, and he was determined to understand the rules. As the turbulence subsided and the cabin settled back into its usual rhythm, Sabrina found herself cornered by Alex near the rear of the plane. You've got quite the presence, he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Most people would have panicked during that turbulence. But you owned it. Sabrina shrugged, careful to keep her expression neutral. It's part of the job. You learn to stay calm under pressure. Alex leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. All right, but there's something different about you. I can't put my finger on it, but I know it's there. Sabrina met his gaze, her own steady and unreadable. I think you're overthinking it. Maybe, Alex said, straightening up, or you're not who you seem to be. The words hung in the air between them, a silent challenge. Sabrina felt a flicker of unease but refused to let it show. She had come too far to let anyone unravel her carefully constructed facade. Still, there was something about Alex, his quiet confidence, his perceptiveness, that made her wonder if he could be an ally or a threat. As the flight continued, Sabrina began to subtly assert her authority. She adjusted the cabin temperature, knowing it would irritate the man in the tailored suit. She accidentally spilled a drink on one of the women's designer handbags, feigning an apology while secretly relishing the look of outrage on her face. Each small act was a test, a way to gauge the passengers' reactions and remind them of their own vulnerability. But it was also a way for Sabrina to reclaim some control, to remind herself why she had chosen to go undercover in the first place. The man in the tailored suit grabbed Sabrina's arm tightly, his face twisted with anger. "You think you can treat me like this?" he growled, his voice low but full of threat. Sabrina looked at him, her eyes cold and calculating. She didn't pull her arm back or show any sign of fear. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice soft but cutting. "I suggest you let go of my arm," she said, each word dripping with authority. The man hesitated, his confidence wavering for a moment. But then he released her, sinking back into his seat with an expression of surprise and fear. Sabrina adjusted her blazer, her gaze still fixed on him. "If you need anything else, just let me know." She walked away, her heart racing but with a sense of satisfaction she couldn't deny. As she returned to the galley, she noticed Alex watching her, his eyes filled with unspoken questions. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said quietly, almost as a warning. Sabrina smiled faintly but didn't respond. She knew the game had already begun, and she had no intention of losing. The cabin was quiet now, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Sabrina moved through the aisle with purpose, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The passengers had grown wary of her, their earlier arrogance tempered by the unsettling sense that she was not someone to be trifled with. But Sabrina knew the calm wouldn't last. The spark of defiance she had ignited earlier was beginning to spread, and she was ready to fan the flames. As she approached the group of women in designer clothes, she noticed one of them, the blonde with the sharp tongue, whispering to her friends, her eyes darting toward Sabrina. They erupted into laughter, the sound brittle and mocking. Sabrina's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She had endured worse in boardrooms and high-stakes meetings, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the stakes were personal. "Can I get you anything else?" Sabrina asked, her tone polite but firm. The blonde smirked. "No thanks. We're good for now." Sabrina nodded and turned to leave, but the blonde's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You know, you're not very good at this," the woman said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "You know, you should consider a different career. Something simpler." The other women giggled, their eyes gleaming with malice. Sabrina felt the heat of anger rise in her chest, but she forced it down, channeling it into something far more dangerous: resolve. She had spent years building her empire, enduring countless slights and setbacks, all to prove that she belonged in a world that had never wanted her. And now, here she was, being mocked by a woman who had never worked a day in her life. It was time to stop playing nice. "Thank you for the feedback," Sabrina said, her voice icy. "I'll be sure to take it into consideration." As she walked away, she caught Alex's eye. He was watching her intently, his expression unreadable. Sabrina ignored him, retreating to the galley to collect her thoughts. But the blonde's words lingered, a spark that threatened to ignite the fire Sabrina had been carefully containing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for: a list of names and notes she had compiled during the flight. Each entry was a reminder of the passengers' behavior, their entitlement, their cruelty. She had been observing them, studying them, and now she had everything she needed to turn the tables. The first target was the man in the tailored suit. Sabrina approached him with a polite smile, her notebook hidden in her pocket. "Sir, I noticed you've been having some trouble with your seat," she said, her tone concerned. "Would you like me to adjust it for you?" The man frowned, clearly suspicious. It's fine. Just leave it. Of course, Sabrina said, nodding. But I should warn you, there's a known issue with this model. It tends to malfunction during landing. I'd hate for you to be uncomfortable. The man's eyes narrowed. What kind of malfunction? Sabrina leaned in slightly, her voice low. Let's just say it's not uncommon for the seat to recline unexpectedly, or, in some cases, lock in place. It's a safety hazard, really. The man paled, his earlier bravado crumbling. Fix it, he demanded, his voice tight. I'll do my best, Sabrina said, her tone sweet but her eyes sharp. As she walked away, she allowed herself a small smile. The man's discomfort was just the beginning. Next, she turned her attention to the group of women. She approached them with a tray of drinks, her expression neutral. Complimentary champagne, she said, placing a glass in front of each woman. A small token of our appreciation for your patience. The blonde raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious. What's the catch? No catch, Sabrina said, her tone light. Just a gesture of goodwill. The women exchanged glances but eventually picked up their glasses. As they sipped the champagne, Sabrina lingered nearby, watching as the liquid spilled onto their designer clothes. Oh, I'm so sorry, Sabrina said, feigning concern. Let me get you some napkins. The women glared at her, their faces flushed with anger. But Sabrina was already walking away, her notebook in hand. The final piece of the puzzle was Alex. He had been watching her all night, his curiosity growing with each passing moment. Sabrina knew she couldn't avoid him forever, but she also couldn't afford to let him get too close. As she passed by the galley, he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. What are you doing? He asked, his voice low but intense. Sabrina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. My job. Alex shook his head. No, this is more than that. You're playing some kind of game, and I want to know what it is. Sabrina hesitated, weighing her options. She could lie, deflect, or walk away. But something in Alex's eyes gave her pause. He wasn't like the others. He was observant, intelligent, and perhaps an ally. What if I am? She said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But if you want answers, you'll have to trust me. Alex studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but don't think I'm not watching you. Sabrina smiled faintly. I wouldn't expect anything less. Sabrina looked down at the notebook in her hands, the names and observations seeming to come alive before her eyes. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. It's time, she murmured to herself, closing the notebook with a soft snap. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, Sabrina felt a strange calm wash over her. The mask was beginning to crack, and she knew she couldn't hold it together much longer. But she didn't mind. She walked into the aisle, stopping beside the man in the tailored suit. He looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and fear. What do you want now? He asked, his voice trembling. Sabrina smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. Just making sure you're comfortable, sir. After all, your experience is our priority. The man didn't respond, but his gaze betrayed the discomfort he felt. Sabrina walked away, feeling the power of her actions beginning to take effect. The cabin was eerily quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by an uneasy silence. The passengers had begun to sense that something was off, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Sabrina moved through the aisle with deliberate calm, her sharp eyes scanning the rows as she prepared for the final act of her carefully orchestrated plan. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sabrina could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was no longer just about observing, it was about taking control. The man in the tailored suit was the first to crack. You, he barked, his voice cutting through the silence as he pointed an accusatory finger at Sabrina. You've been messing with me this entire flight. I demand to speak to the captain. Sabrina stopped in her tracks, turning to face him with a calm that only seemed to infuriate him further. Is there a problem, sir? She asked, her tone polite but laced with steel. You know damn well there's a problem, he snapped, his face red with anger. First the seat, then the temperature, and now this. He gestured wildly to the empty glass in front of him. You've been targeting me, and I want to know why. The other passengers turned to watch, their curiosity piqued. Even the group of women in designer clothes leaned forward, their earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of unease. Sabrina took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. Targeting you, sir? I'm just doing my job. But if you'd like to file a complaint, I'd be happy to provide you with the necessary forms. The man spluttered, clearly unprepared for her composure. But before he could respond, Alex stepped forward, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. Is everything all right here? He asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Sabrina glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. Everything's fine, she said. Our guest here was just expressing some concerns. The man glared at her, but before he could say anything, Sabrina reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device. It was a digital recorder, its red light blinking ominously. What's that? The man demanded, his voice tinged with panic. Evidence, Sabrina replied, her tone cold, of your behavior, your demands, and your complete disregard for the people who work to make your flight comfortable. The cabin erupted into murmurs, the passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The man in the tailored suit paled, his bravado crumbling as he realized the gravity of the situation. But Sabrina wasn't done. She turned to the group of women, her gaze piercing. And as for you, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, I hope you enjoyed the champagne, because the next time you decide to mock someone, you might want to consider who they really are. The blonde woman opened her mouth to protest, but Sabrina held up a hand, silencing her. My name, Sabrina said, her voice ringing out with authority, is Sabrina Harper, and I am the CEO of this airline. The cabin fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The passengers stared at her, their expressions a mix of shock, fear, and disbelief. Even Alex looked stunned, though a flicker of admiration shone in his eyes. Sabrina stepped into the center of the aisle, her posture commanding and her voice steady. For years, I've worked to build this company into what it is today. But tonight, I've seen a side of it that I can no longer ignore. The entitlement, the disrespect, the sheer arrogance. It stops here. She turned to the man in the tailored suit, her gaze icy. Mr. Stewart, your company has been a valued partner of ours for years. But after tonight, I can assure you that partnership is over. The man's face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Sabrina then addressed the group of women. And as for you, your names will be added to our no-fly list. Consider this a lesson in humility. The women gasped, their designer-clad shoulders slumping in defeat. Finally, Sabrina turned to the rest of the passengers, her tone softening but no less firm. To those of you who have shown kindness and respect, thank you. You are the reason I do what I do. But to those who haven't, let this be a reminder. Every interaction is an opportunity to make a difference. Choose wisely. The cabin erupted into murmurs, the passengers exchanging uneasy glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Sabrina stood tall, her mask finally lifted, her true power on full display. As she walked back to the galley, Alex fell into step beside her. Well, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. That was something. Sabrina glanced at him, her expression softening. I told you to trust me. Alex nodded, his admiration clear. You did. And I'm glad I did. The silence in the cabin was almost palpable, the passengers staring at Sabrina with a mix of shock and fear. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words echoing in the air. This is the reality, she said, her voice firm and clear. And this is how we move forward. As the passengers began to stir, some murmuring apologies, others still in a state of shock, Sabrina felt a wave of relief. She had done what needed to be done. Alex stepped closer to her, his gaze filled with admiration and a hint of concern. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next? Sabrina looked at him, a faint smile forming on her lips. I've never been more sure. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the wheels rolling smoothly along the tarmac as the cabin lights flickered on. The passengers sat in stunned silence, the weight of Sabrina's revelation still hanging heavy in the air. No one dared to speak, their earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The once boisterous group of women in designer clothes now sat with their heads bowed, their champagne glasses empty and their confidence shattered. The man in the tailored suit, Mr. Stewart, clutched his armrest, his face pale and his earlier bravado replaced by a simmering anger that he no longer had the courage to voice. Sabrina stood at the front of the cabin, her posture tall and her expression unreadable. She had shed the mask of the flight attendant, and in its place was the commanding presence of a CEO who had just rewritten the rules of the game. Her heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. She had spent years building this company, and tonight, she had taken a stand that would ripple through its foundations. The cost of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she didn't regret it. Not for a moment. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Mr. Stewart shot to his feet, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. "You can't do this," he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Sabrina. "I'll sue you. I'll ruin you." Sabrina turned to face him, her gaze icy. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Stewart, but I suggest you take a long, hard look at your own actions before you threaten me. After all, I have evidence of your behavior, evidence that could easily find its way to the press." The man's face turned ashen, and he sank back into his seat, defeated. The group of women in designer clothes huddled together, their earlier bravado replaced by quiet desperation. One of them, the blonde who had mocked Sabrina so mercilessly, stood up, her voice trembling. "Please," she said, her tone pleading. "We didn't mean any harm. We'll apologize. We'll do anything." Sabrina regarded her coolly, her expression unyielding. "An apology won't undo what's been done, but it's a start." The woman nodded frantically, tears welling in her eyes. "We're sorry. Truly we are." Sabrina's gaze softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Your names will remain on the no-fly list for 6 months. Use that time to reflect on your actions. And if, after that, you can demonstrate genuine change, we'll reconsider." The women nodded, their relief palpable as they sank back into their seats. As the passengers began to disembark, Sabrina watched them go, her expression a mix of satisfaction and quiet reflection. She had made her point, but the cost of her actions weighed heavily on her. The airline's reputation, her relationships with key partners, and even her own career were now at risk. She had taken a stand for herself and every employee who had ever been treated as less than human. Alex approached her, his hands in his pockets and a thoughtful expression on his face. "That was impressive," he said, his tone laced with admiration. "But are you sure it was worth it?" Sabrina turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Alex shrugged. "I get why you did it, but burning bridges like that, it's risky. Not just for them, but for you." Sabrina sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I get it, but sometimes you have to take a stand, even if it's hard." Alex nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Fair enough. But if you ever need someone to help you pick up the pieces, I'm here." Sabrina smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through her stoic exterior. "Thanks, Alex. That means a lot." As the last of the passengers filed out, Sabrina took a deep breath and stepped off the plane, the cool night air a welcome relief after the tension of the flight. She had done what she set out to do, but the journey was far from over. The airline's board would have questions, the media would likely catch wind of the incident, and the fallout would be significant. She felt in control of her own destiny. Sabrina paused at the plane's door, looking out at the horizon where the sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. The cool morning breeze brushed against her face, bringing with it a sense of renewal. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night begin to lift. There was still much work to be done, but she was ready. Alex appeared beside her, his hands in his pockets and a calm smile on his face. "What's next?" Sabrina looked at him, her eyes shining with determination. "Now," she said, "we rebuild." And with that, she took the first step into the new day, ready to face whatever the future held. This story reminds us that true power lies not in authority, but in how we treat others. What would you do if you were in Sabrina's shoes? Or would you side with the passengers? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more gripping tales. And remember, every interaction is a chance to make a difference.